So as I mentioned, we are all dealing with setbacks. And personally, if you haven't been in a setback, maybe you're heading towards one, or maybe you're in the middle of one, or maybe you just went through one. But that's a part of life, and God says He's with us in it all. So our hope is that as we look at this, we'll be looking at setbacks and issues that come into our lives for this week and the next coming weeks. And it's how do you bounce back from those things that happen to us, and sometimes we cause them. And Rick Warren is someone who has a lot of good insight, so I always look at what Rick has to say. But, you know, some of the issues that we face are because of what other people do. Oh, wait. That's pointing at me. Wrong one. It is other people doing stuff that maybe causes problems in our lives. But whatever it is, whether we've caused it or someone else has caused it, we move ahead with how we do things. And so in this particular chapter, we're looking at Acts 27. And Paul, his dream, his desire, was to preach the gospel in Rome. And he's going to get to do that. But the ironic thing is that he's going not as a free man with choice. He's going as a prisoner. He was convicted or charged with a crime that he didn't commit, and he appealed to Caesar, so he is going as a prisoner. And the way to get from where he was to Rome is by boat. And so this whole sermon this morning has to do with that voyage of Paul on the way to Rome. And it says during this voyage, they faced another major setback. And this storm ended up being very costly. And so we want to look at this. How did it happen? What caused it? And then how can we respond in a way that might be of help to us and to others? So, like I said, if you want to read this whole story, it's in Acts chapter 27 and continues into chapter 28. And I'll be bringing out some of the elements of the story, but there are other things that I won't. So, again, I encourage you to read Acts 27. But here's a map. It's the Mediterranean Sea, and you can see it starts here in the east, and then it heads west towards Italy, and then north to Rome. And so Luke is writing this book of Acts, chronicling what's happened. So Luke writes this: we struggled along the coast with great difficulty and finally arrived at Fair Havens near the town of Lasea. And so that is on the island of Crete. And so as they are there, they all kind of know the weather patterns, and I'm not sure whether Paul had some special insight from God, but he knew that trouble was ahead. Said we had lost a lot of time, and the weather was becoming dangerous for sea travel because it was so late in the fall. And Paul spoke to the ship's officers about it. Men, he said, I believe there is trouble ahead if we go on. Shipwreck, loss of cargo, and danger to our lives as well. And so this kind of leads me to think that maybe he had some special insight, or God had kind of told him, hey, there's going to be a problem, because it wasn't just that the weather's going to get bad. He felt like there'd be shipwreck, loss, and danger to lives as well. But the officer in charge of the prisoners listened more to the ship's captain and the owner than to Paul. So here the officer, the Roman officer, was trying to figure out what to do. And Paul was counseling him one way, but he ended up listening to the captain and to the owner, so the one who had authority and had money, and he went with them. So one of the first issues or problems is you could face setbacks listening to the wrong person or taking the wrong advice. And I think as you look back at your life, Whether it's somebody else making a mistake or you making a mistake, you just were listening to the wrong person, and it sent you down the wrong road. So that's one way to get into a storm. And so who do you listen to, as you're trying to decide what to do? And so the encouragement is always start with the Lord. Listen to God. And so part of what God says is, I will direct you, I will guide you as you listen to me. And God speaks primarily through His Word, the Bible. So if you're not reading it, then again, He's going to have problems speaking into your life and helping you. It says if you need wisdom, ask our generous God, and He will give it to you. And He won't rebuke you for asking, but when you ask Him, be sure that your faith is in God alone. So part of that's a step of faith, saying, God, I'm not sure. Will you help me? Will you guide me? And God's promise is, yeah, I will. And James goes on and says, do not waver, for a person with divided loyalty is as unsettled as a wave of the sea that is blowing and tossed by the wind. And so that's kind of how it works. We look to God, and then we sort of sense maybe God wants to go this way, but we're not quite sure. And so maybe we listen, maybe we don't. Maybe we look for people who agree more with where we want to go. And so James is saying, don't waver. If you're going to ask God, say, yeah, Lord, whatever you say, I will do. But a lot of us say, well, Lord, tell me what you're going to do, what you want me to do, and then I'll think about it, and I'll decide what I want. But James says, don't do that. If you want wisdom, you got to go all in. And we continue on in Acts. It says, since the harbor was not a good one to winter, since the harbor was not a good one to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. So this is not Phoenix, Arizona. This is Phoenix in Italy, and it had a harbor that was a little bit better. But you see here that the majority decided to sail on. And that's the second problem. You can face setbacks by following the crowd, by going along with the majority. By saying, well, let's take a poll, and then we'll decide. And that's not always the best way to go. And you know this. The majority is not always right. And so if you're trying to do your life by seeing what everybody thinks, you are going to be tossed and turned and probably come into a lot more problems than you would have if you just were listening to God or listening to the right people. And this happened in the Old Testament when Israel was going in to the Promised Land. God told Moses to send in 12 spies, a representative from each of the 12 tribes. And so he sent them into the Promised Land to scout it out, to bring a report back, and to let the people know what they found out. And so when they returned, they got this. We entered the land you sent us to explore, and indeed it is a bountiful country, a land flowing with milk and honey. So that whole image of milk and honey is another way of saying, man, there's a lot of good things there. The land is rich with all kinds of resources. And Caleb, along with Joshua, said, let's go at once to take the land. We can certainly conquer it. And so these two guys said, hey, we saw it, it's beautiful, let's go. But the other men, the other 10, who had explored the land with him disagreed. We can't go up against them. They are stronger than we are. So they spread this bad report about the land among the Israelites. So when they came back, the two were saying, hey, it's great, but the 10, the majority, were saying, hey, these people are strong. There's people there. We can't take them on. Who are we? And even though God said, this is your land, I promise it to you, they're saying, nope, can't do it. And so they ended up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. And so God gave them what they wanted. They didn't want to go in, so they wandered the desert until every one of the people who didn't want to go in had passed away. And then when a new generation came up, that's when they entered the land. But the majority was not right. And so sometimes, and you know this, that your mom will say, well, just because everyone else did it, if they jumped off a bridge, would you too? And, when you're young, it's like, yeah, I'd do that, Mom. But here's like lemmings, and one of the lemmings going off the cliff says, I'm having second thoughts. And so when you follow the majority and it goes south, then too late you realize, I shouldn't have done that. So following the crowd can lead to major setbacks. So be aware of that. And then it said a soft wind from the south began to blow. And the men thought that they could carry out their plan. Then, and when a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity. So this is the NIV. So when the winds were gentle and were very calm, it says that they thought they could do it. They saw an opportunity to go, and they did. They left. But very soon, a strong wind, the one called the northeaster, blew down from the island. And so all of a sudden there was a storm. What looked good, what looked calm, which looked like an opportunity, all of a sudden became a crisis, a storm, a disaster. And so the third problem is you can face setbacks by depending only on the circumstances to guide you. So it's not unwise to look at the circumstances, but if you do something only because the circumstance is there, then that's a foolish way to go. Well, I took the money because it was just sitting there. Or, I did this deal because I didn't think anybody would catch me. It looked like it was all going to work out and I could do it without anybody noticing. But, if you go by circumstances, again, whether it's you or somebody else, it could lead you down the wrong path. And I've shared this before. My brother and I went out fishing out of Half Moon Bay. It was a beautiful day. It looked great. And, we're going to go spend the day fishing. So we took off and looking forward to a great day. And we just got to the fishing spot and we could see the fog coming in. And it was coming in pretty quickly. And just in a matter of minutes, you couldn't see anything. I mean, you could see the ocean. So it was kind of bizarre. You knew that the coastline was right in front of you, but you couldn't see it. And the bright, cheery ocean all of a sudden became very menacing, and it was scary, and we're going, what do we do? And as you can tell, we did make it back, because I'm here today, but it just surprised me and my brother, how quickly the fog could come in. So you can face setbacks if you just look at the circumstances to guide you. So what can happen when you're in the storm? And here in the story it says the sailors couldn't turn the ship into the wind, so they gave up and let it run before the gale. So they couldn't control the ship. They were overcome by it, and they just gave up. They quit trying and just let the ship go wherever the wind took them. So one of the things that we could do is we can give up and stop trying. And you know that that's not the right thing to do. But in the storm, in a setback, sometimes you just feel overwhelmed. And you just say, well, I'm not going to try. I quit. I give up. It wasn't supposed to be like this. But take heart. And that's part of what we need to be looking at. What can we do to overcome that desire to give up? So the next day, as gale force winds continued to batter the ship, the crew began throwing the cargo overboard. So then the next thing that can happen in the storm is you can start throwing things away. And they thought, well, this cargo is not as important as our lives. And that's a true statement. Sometimes where you are in a difficult spot, things are falling apart, and it's really a crisis. You do reset your priorities. You do look at things in a different way. And as you know, my parents passed away, and my mom passed away of COVID, and we were there with her. And so we were exposed. We took our tests, and we're waiting for the tests to come back. But when I found out that my mom had died of COVID, all of a sudden, all the plans that I had made, all the things that I thought were important, weren't important anymore. It was just about my health and praying that I was going to be well and thinking about my family. And so all of the other stuff kind of falls away. It's like, nope, not important. Can I still smell? Can I still taste? And then you're just waiting for the test to come back, and it came back negative, but we still quarantined for that couple of weeks. But in the midst of all that, you think about, well, what's really important? And it says the following day, they even took some of the ship's gear and threw it overboard. And so the other thing, kind of to be, as you face setbacks, make sure you aren't throwing important things away. So sometimes it's important to reprioritize, to throw some things out that you thought were important, but make sure that you're checking what you are throwing out, that you're not getting rid of or damaging things that are important. Because sometimes in a crisis, when you're a setback or a storm, sometimes people give up things they shouldn't be giving up. Maybe their job, maybe their marriage, maybe their integrity, just to react to the storm around them. So it's really important to be thinking about what is going on and what you might be getting rid of, which isn't going to be helpful. And I go back to what Max Lucado was saying as we looked at the series, You'll Get Through This. He says, you'll get through this. It won't be painless. It won't be quick. But God will use this mess for good. And then this is the important part. In the meantime, don't be foolish or naive. But don't despair either. With God's help, you will get through this. And the important word here is, in the midst of the struggle, the setback, the storm, don't do anything stupid. Don't be foolish, because it's easy to kind of go in that direction. So make sure you step back, and with God's counsel and maybe with other people of faith, that you begin to reprioritize and figure out where you're going to go. But it says a terrible storm raged for many days, blotting out the sun and the stars until at last all hope was gone. So as the storm raged on, they had hope, little hope, and then finally no hope at all. And it looked like it was 14 days in the storm with no stars to guide. They couldn't see the sun. And you may feel like that, where it's been dark, not just for a few days, but weeks, maybe months, maybe years. And that the hope that you once had has disappeared. And it's a human, natural thing to happen, to move to despair when things are tough, especially when it takes a long time. Because in the storm and in our difficulty, I often find God does move much more slowly than I would like him to. I'd like it to be speeded up. It's like, okay, God, I get it. Good, you are the Lord. Let's move on. But that often doesn't happen. Storms and setbacks can reveal our character and our faith. So the people, the crew, had no hope. But Paul was a little bit different. He had another way of moving, which we'll look at. So in the middle of the storm, he became a beacon of hope and an encourager, and helping them to carry on and not to give up hope. So Paul has some words for them, but he first says this, which I probably wouldn't have said, but Paul said it. Paul called the crew together and said, "Men, you should have listened to me in the first place and not left Crete. You would have avoided all this damage and loss." So, not saying this is a biblical thing to do to be a know-it-all, but Paul says, hey, remember I told you not to do this. And maybe it was his way of saying, okay, you didn't listen to me then, maybe you listen to me now. He says, take courage. None of you will lose your lives, even though the ship will go down. For last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me. And he said, don't be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar. So here in this passage, what I see is Paul is affirming the presence of God and the purpose of God. He says, an angel of the Lord, the presence of God, the God to whom I belong to, the one who I'm preaching about, the one I serve, this messenger of God stood beside me. And it's a reminder to us that, we can't see God. We can only by faith know that the Lord is there and that He is with us. And so one of the challenges is in the midst of the storm to affirm that God will never leave you or forsake you, and that there's nothing that can take the Lord's presence away from you. And here the angel also affirms that you will still surely stand before Caesar, that God had a plan and a purpose for Paul, that there was a movement forward. And so maybe this will help you. These are anchors of faith, that God is present and that God is working in your life to some future goal that maybe we don't see. We can't see Him and we can't see the future, but we know it's there. And he says, what's more, God in His goodness has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. So take courage, for I believe God. It will be just as He said. So in this, Paul affirms the goodness of God, but also the promise of God, that God says, I'm not going to die and neither will you. And so take courage, be encouraged. I believe in God and it'll be just as He said. So he's saying, depend on the Word of God. And that's for us too, that we need to know the promises of God and rely on them. Scripture tells us that God is not a man that He should lie. And so know the promises of God, especially in those areas that relate to the storm or the struggles that you face, and depend on them, stand on them, trust in Him. It will be just as the Lord said. And then Paul urged everyone to eat. You've been so worried that you haven't touched food for 2 weeks. Please eat something now for your own good, for not a hair on your head will perish. So it's interesting here, Paul moves from faith and the presence of God to, hey, get something to eat. You haven't eaten anything in so long, and you're not going to be able to do well without taking care of yourself. And, that could be an encouragement to us too, that spiritually we sometimes are aware of our need, but you also need to be taking care of your body, getting enough rest, eating the right food, taking time away where it's not always go, go, go. Finding a place to encourage Sabbath, to get the rest of God. But Paul was aware of this, and he told them, eat. And then he took some bread, gave thanks to God before them, and broke off a piece and ate it. Then everyone was encouraged and began to eat. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read this, I think of someone else who took bread and gave thanks to God and broke it. And that was Jesus. And here Paul is taking bread and giving thanks to God and then passing out the bread to others, and they were encouraged. And so this whole idea of communion and knowing the presence of God, I think is important for all of us. And we'll get into that later. And it says, so everyone escaped safely to shore. So it was as Paul said. But we're all dealing with, crisis and difficulty. And we are in a time of hopelessness, fear, and discouragement. Whether it's in you or it's around us, but it's there. And you could, see it. You can sense it. And so my encouragement to you is be an encourager to others. Maybe others in our church, others in your community, maybe family, in your workplace. But be like Paul. Find ways to bring hope and to help bring courage. And we hear this in Thessalonians. Encourage one another. Build each other up. And so others who we know of in the faith, and I think people who just need a word of encouragement. That's part of what God wants us to do, not just to take care of ourselves, but to really make sure we're in helping and focusing on others too. So in the midst of the pandemic and the crisis and the difficulties, be aware of how can you help other people. So it says be an encourager, and in small print, the world has plenty of critics already. So we often, especially if it's somebody else's fault that we're in trouble, or that we can blame somebody else, it's natural to do. But, let that go and move in a positive direction. And there's a mutual blessing that can happen. You be encouraging, and you'll be encouraged. Because I think the two go together. As you encourage others, you yourself are encouraged. So in the midst of the storm that you face, I face, our community, our country faces, it's important to refocus in on what Christ has done. And he has come and said, know that I am with you. And I've given my life for you. And so believe in me, trust in me, and be of good cheer. Be of good faith, for I have overcome the world. And so that's a part of how we kind of move through the storms of life. Remember, setbacks become a tremendous springboard for God's will. So the setback and the problems becomes ways that God can move you forward, and maybe the people around you forward. So may God bless you as you deal with the setbacks in your life. And may you look for God's work and word and blessing to you. God bless you.